So, next perspective we have from Robert Engelman, who's the former president of the World Watch Institute in America. They're a globally focused environmental research organization based in Washington, D.C. Paul has directed its programs on population and the environment for a number of years. Paul, I keep calling you Paul. Robert, Bob, I think I've got here Bob. That's nothing like Paul. Bob has served on the faculty of Yale University as a visiting lecturer and was founding secretary of the Society of Environmental Journalists. So very important to make sure that these messages are out in public. He's written a number of books and published scholarly articles. He's also been published in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Bob serves on the board of the Population Resource Center and the Nova Institute. He holds a Master's of Science degree from Columbia Grad School of Journalism and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Chicago. So Bob, tell us, is sustainability still possible? Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Bon dia, buenos dias, and good morning. I want to thank particularly Antonio, Fernando, Luis, and Albert in the conference secretariat for inviting me to speak to you at this conference, as well as Jane for introducing me. I, who have never built a structure any more sustainable than what I could do with building blocks, tinker toys, and beach sand. But I've been fortunate over the last 25 years to spend time as a journalist and then a researcher, studying the issue of environmental sustainability writ large. The question really of whether modern human civilization can survive the scale of activities that we are now engaged in, the kinds of things that I think were introduced in the context of a single city in the case of Paul Chan's talk just now. Last year, my organization, the World Watch Institute, published this book. We publish State of the World every year, and it has a theme, or has had for the last 12 years, and this was this question that was the theme actually of Paul Chan's talk: is sustainability possible, still possible? And I'm a believer that when you raise a question like that, you had better answer it. So I plan to answer it in this address, so please stay tuned. And I'm grateful that the conference has afforded me an opportunity to think about this question of sustainability in a context that I'm not greatly expert on, but admire greatly, which is the ability to construct buildings that become our homes and places of work and business and stand tall for decades and indeed centuries to come. So let me begin with a quotation from the early 19th century English poet and in fact artist William Blake that helps explain my admiration for sustainable building. Blake said, "He who would do good must do it in minute particulars. General good is the plea of the flatterers, for art and science cannot exist but in minutely organized particulars." Lots of people talk about sustainability, but builders have to consider sustainability in minutely organized particulars, in the specifics in designing of a structure and the building of a structure. And you must do this while assuring first structural integrity, obviously, secondly affordability, that's key, and only when you've met these two important needs can you really begin to think about sustainability, which is an incredible challenge to add to those first two. So you have my respect in that. That said, I must also say that I believe that it's difficult to impossible to construct a sustainable building in an unsustainable world, which is the world that we are living in. I'm not sure there are any truly sustainable buildings now. Rather, I believe that sustainable building is an ideal toward which we travel rather than something that we accomplish with any specific structure. Show me a sustainable building, and if I'm able to study it long enough in its minutely organized particulars, I'm likely to aggravate you with illustrations of what there is about not just its operation, but also its construction its maintenance, its periodic rehabilitation, its future retrofitting, and its eventual decay or demolition that could not be sustained over time if all buildings were built in just that way with just those materials. Now, this isn't to minimize your work, and I don't have any doubt that you're very aware of this, more aware even than I, when you do the work that you do on buildings. But it is critically important to look at sustainability this way if the environment and civilization itself are to survive the next century. Rather, this is a plea to get back to precision in language in what we talk about and how we communicate our purpose in what we do so that we can accomplish our objectives. It really is a call to a discipline of communication about what we're doing. Now, the concept of sustainability, true sustainability, is essential to the global conversation we need on how human well-being is not only to be attained but maintained for as many decades and centuries as we can reasonably imagine. And the issue isn't only our own well-being, but that of nature and non-living beings that are our only known companions in the universe. Nature is not a luxury. Excuse me a second. It's essential to our prosperity, our health, our sanity, and the happiness and richness of our lives. And people inherently understand this. The idea of environmental sustainability has exploded into our languages and gained increasing popularity in the public consciousness. Increasingly, too, it has been watered down by the mass media, hence this illustration, and especially by corporations, some of them who are serious about sustainability and are really making some good progress in developing it, and then others who, in effect, are bragging about something that I'm rather dubious that they're actually trying to achieve in a very serious way. I don't mean to pick on Ferrari. Some of you may drive Ferraris. I happened to be in Shanghai a year ago and saw this billboard at a technology show exposition, and I thought it was amusing and was an illustration of the fact that this has now become something that corporations use for marketing, which is good in a sense in that it means that people get sustainability and they want sustainability and they would like to purchase sustainability, but it's not necessarily good if it doesn't mean anything and reduces sustainability to something that no longer has a meaning. We looked at a linguistic study in our book that was based on the idea that of the exponential growth in the use of the word sustainable in the English language, and which projected that in less than a century it will be the only word used in the English language. Now, the study was not, unfortunately, peer-reviewed, but in a rare lapse of our standards for State of the World at the World Watch Institute, we used this illustration in our book anyway. Now, inevitably, we're getting to see now something of a backlash about the word sustainability. This is from a column in The Economist recently. I always thought stakeholder, which I think Jane just used, was a pretty nice word, but apparently stakeholder and sustainability is now something of a cliche, at least so The Economist thinks. So we need to be guarded about that issue. So let's take a moment to consider what sustainability is, what it really means, and especially in relation to the minute particulars of constructing buildings, how we can measure it and know when we have arrived at true sustainability. Here's the definition that a prominent World Commission offered in 1987. And it's been, I think, the most authoritative definition yet of sustainable development, but within sustainable development, what sustainability actually means. This is a funny phenomenon. I can always use this laser pointer at home when I test it, and even in my hotel room in the morning, but when I make an address, it never works. So I'll just have to rely on your ability to read that. Now, we could translate this simply as living decently in the present without undermining the capacity of future generations to live just as decently. An activity is sustainable if it can continue indefinitely at its current scale and current pace without in any way undermining the conditions that allow it to operate. We can measure this in climate, in our use of fresh water and other renewable resources, in our treatment of the living world. We can apply a sustainability metric, a measurement, to see if we are leaving as much to our descendants as our ancestors, in effect, left to us. It's important to perform this metric for any activity we engage in that we want to claim as sustainable. It's not enough to simply have less impact or to target some percentage reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or use of natural resources or other aspects of materials consumption. These are important first steps, and it's not to diminish the goal or the stretch goal that we set for ourselves to diminish or minimize emissions by, say, 30% by a set time. But it's not enough. To be sustainable, we need to demonstrate that what we do, in what we do, everyone who comes after us can also do at the same scale without weakening the fabric of future societies and civilizations. This is a very tall order. To put the process of building structures and infrastructure into perspective, it's important to acknowledge that human beings are now a force of nature. What we are doing to the landscape is greater than what wind and water and changes in temperature are doing to the landscape, and it goes beyond this. What we are doing to the polar ice caps is now visible from outer space. If there's an extraterrestrial civilization looking at the Earth through telescopes, they're wondering what's going on with the polar ice caps that have been so stable for thousands of years. And in a few decades, we're actually going to change the coastlines of the world's globe. Imagine having a globe that you've got for your children, that when they give it to their children, it's out of date because Florida looks completely different than it did when the globe was made. Now, in the construction industry, you could actually think of renewable, non-renewable materials like sand, lime, and clay, the materials we use to build buildings. And all of these literal building blocks of construction are non-renewable resources that we're using with increasing rapidity, even if it's hard to imagine that we could ever exhaust them. But the reality is that Saudi Arabia and much of the Middle East have now banned the export of sand. Can you imagine? Simply because they want to make sure they have enough for all the construction that's going on massively in the building of large cities in these areas. In India, the price of sand is soaring to the extent that it's actually inhibiting some of the construction in the megacities of Mumbai and elsewhere. It's just simply hard to get all the sand you need into the right places. Now, getting more attention than sand, obviously, is our impact on the world's carbon cycle and the sustainability of the atmosphere's regulation of climate. And despite all of our global efforts to rein in the greenhouse gas emissions that we're now in the process of putting in the atmosphere, you can't see the results in this curve. You can't see the Kyoto Protocol in this curve. You can't see the Copenhagen conference that we had in 2009. It's a little depressing. Then there's the water cycle, with a fifth of the world's people today facing physical water scarcity. This number is climbing fast as more and more nations increase their population, cross thresholds of physical water stress or water scarcity, and dramatically increase the number of people living in this category. Today, 15% of food production is based on the unsustainable use of water, chiefly bringing water out of aquifers that then are dropping to the point that eventually it won't be economical, at least, to bring that water up to the surface. And when that water's gone, the food is gone. Or consider that humanity is now the overwhelming force in the world's nitrogen cycle. Or that we are now the decisive factor in species extinctions. A few years ago, there was a report published in Nature by the Stockholm Resilience Center at the University of Stockholm with some 20 authors saying that of 9 key planetary boundaries, we've now grossly exceeded 3. Basically, carbon, climate emissions, the nitrogen cycle, and biodiversity. This is the first time in the Earth's history that one species has been the decisive factor in species extinction, and we are that species. That's why geologists say we're now entering the Anthropocene, the ecological, geological, biological era that is in fact driven by human beings. When I look at this photo of Mexico City, or a photo of any of the world's 28 megacities, those with 10 million inhabitants or more, I can't help but ask, if every one of these buildings were a sustainable building, would we have a sustainable city and a sustainable landscape? And I have to ask, and I'm a little dubious, can you have sustainable buildings in a fundamentally sustainable society with unsustainable population growth, unsustainable consumption, unsustainable sprawl? The current projections for world population is that it will move from about 7.3 billion people we have now to 9, 10, or possibly 11 Probability is now around 11 by the end of the century. Most of this growth, almost all of it, will take place in cities. We now have 28 megacities. We're expected to have or projected to have 41 by 2030. Who knows how many we'll have by the end of the century. This is a massive amount of construction. It's important to integrate social, moral, and ethical considerations in looking at these questions. If you look closely at this landscape, you'll see that these buildings are primarily residences for people who are not particularly wealthy. And so an important priority for the world's governments has to be, and I think is, how to assure at least some level of prosperity and equality or equal opportunity for all people, or at least come as closely as possible to eliminating extreme poverty, which we're doing a good job of doing in the sense that we're building a middle class. It's been one of the most successful of the Millennium Development Goals. I'm afraid I'm about to get some bad news.
Please, no bad news. Just so people don't start to leave, we started a bit late, so relax. Everything's just going to run a little bit later today, so Bob, take your time, finish off, but please don't feel like you're going to miss your next session.
Okay, I will try not to delay you too long from what I'm sure are great refreshments out there. But I do think I will try to summarize some of this to make it a little easier for you. We have a global middle class emerging and is growing much faster than the world population as a whole. It is a success story. Though it's worth noting that 1.2 billion people still do live on about $1 a day. Those of us with more than enough can hardly resent or be sorry about the fact that we're extending the middle class to others. We can't look down on that. That's a success story. And many commentators look at this and they say, well, so what's the big deal about ecological limitations? Maybe there aren't any, or maybe they don't matter very much. But they do matter. They matter from the standpoint of time in the future. It's just this capacity to sell the Earth's resources as rapidly and cheaply as possible to generate consumption for more people around the world that actually puts the future at risk. So fairness and justice are issues that we have to integrate with our goal of somehow finding a way to make sure there is a future for our children, grandchildren, and generations and beyond us ourselves. Now, architects and builders obviously can't make the world sustainable and fair all by themselves. But this is where the minutely organized particulars that you're discussing at this conference come in and add value to a value-starved and unsustainable world. And no doubt the most important particular, and one that Paul Chan talked about, is energy. The building sector contributes an estimated 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. I was intrigued to see that Paul mentioned that Hong Kong has 60% of its emissions from buildings. This makes all the sense in the world. Hong Kong is a 100% urban area. I think we'd call it 100% urban. And the world is about 50% urban. So it makes sense that half of the world's emissions would be from the building sector. This is a huge amount. And presumably the building sector will have to engage in this 50% reduction the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need by 2050, with an ultimate goal of becoming emission neutral. No emissions at all. Now imagine how we're going to be able to do this in the building sector so that the construction of building and all the other aspects I mentioned about buildings can actually effectively be emission neutral. This is actually a very extreme scenario. It's these orange areas on the right that show how much the building sector is projected by 2030. It ignores the global recession because it was made at the beginning of the global recession. I doubt we're anywhere near halfway up these orange slopes right now. But nonetheless, it's instructive to see what the IPCC thought the world building sector would be contributing by 2030. It's rather daunting. And it gives us an idea of what we would need to do to actually achieve sustainability in buildings just in the energy sector. Now, on the upside, most experts that I talk to consider building one of the most positive sectors for these kinds of improvements. The things that you're talking about today are so exciting. I know a number of home builders in the United States, and I'm amazed at the enthusiasm they have for homes that are actually energy neutral and how it's getting more and more common to build homes that are really energy sufficient. But of course, when you realize that most of the buildings we'll have in the middle of the century have been built already, that becomes still sobering. We have to think about retrofitting and sustainable retrofitting. And no matter how sustainably they're constructed, of course, buildings occupy space. So space becomes an issue. The actual footprint of building is one of the reasons, and the roads that feed buildings, the networks of roads that feed settlement, population settlement, are among the reasons the World Wildlife Fund And the Global Footprint Network recently concluded that 50% of all vertebrate animals, not of animal species, but of actual animals, have disappeared in the last 40 years. This trend line shows what we're reaching now. Half of these animals have disappeared. This is really incredible. And of course, as we build out our megacities and urban areas, we're also displacing fertile farmland, which tends to be close to cities. That has to go to less fertile farmland. It takes more farmland to grow the same amount of food, displacing even more species. In large part because of the massive scale of humanity and our activities, even the efforts we make to become sustainable can sometimes cause problems. So for example, this little critter is called the hoary bat. And this bat in particular is drawn to tall trees to meet partners. And in large parts of North America where this bat lives, the very tallest trees are now wind turbines. Recently there was an estimate that wind turbines are killing, I believe this is worldwide, 600,000 to 900,000 bats per year. Now bats, which are also subject to a horrible fungal disease in North America that's also killing them, are the farmer's best friend for getting rid of insects. If we lose bats, we've really lost a very, very close friend in our food production. So all of these things are connected. So is there any good news about sustainability? Absolutely. And I don't want to leave with nothing but bad news. I think we've taken care of the ozone hole. It is repairing itself. That's very good news. We've slowed the pace of deforestation, particularly I'm sure there are people here from Brazil. Brazil has had tremendous success in slowing the loss of the Amazon. And in fact, overall wood cover is probably increasing in the world. Young forests, but nonetheless forests are increasing. Fisheries, certainly in the United States and other parts of the world, Australia, we're increasingly understanding that we need quota systems for dealing with fisheries decline, and fisheries are rebounding in much of the world. Not everywhere, but they're rebounding. I don't think I need to tell you what a positive story, and Paul just showed us in Hong Kong, what a positive story renewable energy is around the world. It's growing faster than any other form of energy. These are pieces of great news. Now, I have to say, when I think about the building sector and how it's part of this good news story, I'm just as excited as anybody else about net neutral energy buildings, emission neutral buildings, positive energy buildings, the kind of things Paul talked about. The idea that you can now program energy efficiency in your home or your office building with a smartphone, these are very exciting. But given the problems of poverty and the 7.2 billion, 7.3 billion people we have today, I also gravitate and get very excited about ideas for how can we reuse simple materials that are now being wasted to make buildings for people, make functional buildings for people, particularly the poor. One of the more interesting stories, I think, is shipping crates. The world's building shipping crates. There's 17 million of these things around the world, and they're mostly hanging out in ports. Since the global recession began, more and more of them are just simply stacking up in the world's port cities. Only a third of these boxes are actually on the world's oceans at any given time. So people have gotten the idea that, maybe we could make things with these shipping crates. And in fact, some architects have gotten extremely inventive in what they're able to build with shipping crates. Now, I don't know that we'd all want to live in a shipping crate, but if you put your imagination to work, the kind of imagination that I have every confidence that each of you possess here at this conference, this is something that we could probably do. And shipping crates are just one example. Another one that fascinates me that really is extremely low-tech is liters of light. I don't know how many of you have heard about this concept. It's an extremely simple concept, which is that you simply take water bottles, plastic water bottles, not even these glass kind, but the kind that are thrown away routinely in garbage dumps all around the world. And you fill them with water, and you place half of them above the roof of a corrugated metal shack in a slum. And it actually, during the day, of course, not at night, but during the day, it simply refracts the light of the sun and brings it into the building itself, allowing children to study, to do their homework during the day in what were previously pretty dark, unpleasant corrugated metal buildings that billions of the people, certainly hundreds of millions of the world's people live in. Using nature, we saw some green roofs in Hong Kong. These are two buildings I saw in Iceland recently, or it's actually one unified building built by Vikings. It's a modern recreation, but gives you a sense of how in the cold Arctic, the Scandinavian people learned how to use earthen covered buildings for warmth and for other things, grazing their animals on them, as a matter of fact. Certainly just from a physical perspective, this connects us with nature and also, of course, has multiple other benefits. Using nature to actually adorn buildings, to help buildings with energy efficiency, is an idea that obviously is here, and I'm sure there are sessions about this concept here at the conference today. I find that very exciting. But let me, winding up here and talking about the sort of, again, the social aspect of building sustainability, let me suggest that this is one of the most sustainable kinds of buildings we can build. Health clinics, and particularly clinics that offer family planning services to women and men around the world who actually would like to plan their families and perhaps have fewer children than they would otherwise have. This is in Uganda. Now, there was just a report from the United Nations that suggested there really is a probability, let's see if I can get this to work now. No, still not. That we will be in this curve in the middle here, this sort of red curve that will actually go up to about 11 billion people by the end of the century. But this ignores the fact that we have the capacity to change these things. I'm sure you believe this or you wouldn't be attending a conference like this. And it's as true of population as it is true of building the world's future buildings and retrofitting the buildings that we have today. That we have the capacity to change these things. Women in Africa are not necessarily having 6 or 7 children because they're so excited about having 6 or 7 children. Some of them feel they need to for social and cultural reasons, but I've talked to a lot of women in Africa, and I find very few that are genuinely enthusiastic about families that large. It's very hard. It's very hard for them. It's very dangerous for them. Many of them die in childbirth. The reality is that about 40% of the world's pregnancies are unintended, and about half of those result in unplanned births. If we attend to the education of women in schools, which need to be built, of girls, education of girls and the education of women, if we attend to people's health and women's reproductive health in particular, there's no question in my mind that we will end somewhere in that lower zone and have a lower population because we don't really know the future population of the world. And I would suggest that every aspect of sustainable building will be easier to achieve if we have that lower population. So people often ask me, because I work for an environmental think tank, are you optimistic? And I have to answer when I'm asked that in a yes or no question. No, I'm not. I'm not optimistic. But I don't think one has to be. I don't think a sort of a mindless determination to be optimistic is the key thing. Do I think sustainability is still possible? I promised you an answer to that question. Absolutely. Sustainable is possible. Sustainability is possible. But we're running out of time. We have very, very little time left. Time is, in fact, the scarcest resource of all. I think to think about these issues, we need to be holistic in our thinking. We need to be rigorous in our definitions of what sustainability means in our own work. We need to go outside and we need to go inside. By outside, I mean thinking about these broader social issues that are part of society, part of population, part of economics, part of politics, which we obviously need to engage in. And we need to go to think in terms of what we're doing for the future and have a very expansive view of the future. A lot of what we do, and this is very true in population, a report just came out on this, and I think it's true in building generally and true dealing with climate change. There's this sense it's so small what I do, and it will take so long to have an impact. And I'm always reminded of the Europeans who 1,000 years ago laid the foundations of cathedrals that they knew they would never see completed. That they knew only at best their children or their grandchildren would see the final capstone of the central tower of a cathedral or the completion of a nave like the Sagrada Familia here in Barcelona. And yet no one asked them, are you optimistic about this? No, they simply were putting blocks of stone upon blocks of stone. There's a story that John F. Kennedy used to tell, President Kennedy in the United States, based on a French story of a householder who needed shade for his building. This is a story about sustainable building. The sun was heating up his home. He needed a tree to shade his home. So he asked his gardener, he said, could you plant an oak tree sometime in the next 2 or 3 days so that it can shade the home? And the gardener said, well, sir, what would be the point of that? An oak tree takes 50 years to get big enough to shade this tree. And the householder said, 50 years? Plant the tree this morning. We don't have a second to lose. And I think that's the essence of the view that we need to bring to our work in sustainability. Am I a pessimist? No. What would be the point? And this is where it comes, this is where I talk about going inside. For me, the most important moment is the present moment. I don't think we're obligated to predict the future and say what we think will happen in the future any more than the gardener planting that oak tree or the people who built Europe's cathedrals 1,000 years ago. No, our obligation is to be grateful for the incredible world we live in. It is a beautiful world. The work that we do is incredibly important. We're all blessed, myself and all of us here, to do this kind of work that is making a contribution to the future. Don't worry about the future. The future will unfold, but appreciate the fact that you have the opportunity every moment to place brick upon brick, constructing, hopefully, we hope, a building or a sustainable society that will last for a very, very long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. The most important point that I think you've left us with today is that sustainable buildings aren't necessarily that useful in a non-sustainable world. So thank you for providing that larger context. I think it is very important to keep that quite present in our minds as we delve into the detail about what our role is and what our responsibility is and what we can do when we leave this conference. So yes, we will finish there. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our two speakers again.